Jerusalem. Golgotha, the place of the skull. A Roman soldier stands before a corpse nailed to wood. He raises his lance, one thrust, upward, angled toward the heart. Blood and water pour from the wound. In that instant, a man no one will ever remember becomes the most consequential spear carrier in human history. He doesn't know it yet. He's about to wish he never raised that weapon. This story doesn't end here. But if you're not subscribed, it ends for you right now. But before we get to what happened next, let's go back for a moment. To understand how a nameless auxiliary ended up at the foot of history's most famous execution, you need to understand what it meant to be a Roman soldier in 1st century Judea. This man wasn't a legionary from Rome. He wasn't some proud son of the Tiber. He was probably Syrian, possibly Samaritan, a local conscript, serving the empire that occupied his own homeland. The pay was decent. The work was not. And this was the worst assignment. Golgotha wasn't a sacred hill. Forget the paintings. Forget the hymns. This was a garbage heap outside the city walls. The air stank of rot, of human waste, of bodies left too long in the sun. Flies swarmed thick enough to choke on. The ground was hard, uneven, littered with the debris of previous executions. 3 crosses stood against a pale sky. A crowd had gathered since morning, some weeping, some mocking, most just watching the way people always watch suffering that isn't theirs. The sound? Labored breathing, occasional screams. The indifferent chatter of soldiers who'd done this 100 times before. Our soldier was part of a small detachment assigned to crucifixion duty. His job was simple: make sure the condemned die, confirm death, prevent rescue attempts. Standard Roman protocol for executions during Passover, when the city swelled with pilgrims and tensions ran higher than usual. The problem was timing. Jewish law forbade bodies hanging overnight, especially before the Sabbath. And this wasn't just any Sabbath. This was Passover, the holiest week of the year. The religious authorities wanted these men dead and buried before sunset. The order came down the chain: break their legs. Speed this up. Breaking the legs wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was efficiency. A crucified man supports his weight by pushing up on his nailed feet. Break the legs, and he can't push. He suffocates within minutes. It's brutal, yes, but it's fast. The soldier moved to the 1st cross, did his work. Moved to the 3rd, same. Then he approached the middle cross, the one everyone would remember. The man was already dead, or appeared to be. Here's the complication. How do you confirm death on a cross? You can't check a pulse from the ground. You can't get close to the face without a ladder. The body hangs limp, but crucified men lose consciousness all the time. They come back. They gasp. They linger. So he did what any soldier would do. He took his lance, the standard issue pilum or lancea carried by auxiliary units, and thrust it into the side. Upward, toward the heart. Blood and water flowed out. Now, if you know anything about anatomy, you know what that means. The water was pericardial fluid, the liquid that surrounds the heart. Mixed with blood, it indicates the heart has stopped. Medically speaking, this was confirmation. The man was dead. A job done. The soldier withdrew his lance, wiped it clean, probably. Stepped back. He walked away from that hill thinking his day was over. He had no idea it was just beginning. According to tradition, and I want to be clear here, we're stepping into territory where history and legend blur. Something happened in that moment the soldier didn't expect. The blood splashed. Some of it reached his face, his eyes. Later accounts, particularly the apocryphal Acts of Pilate and the hagiographies that followed centuries after, claim this soldier suffered from an eye affliction. Some sources say partial blindness, Others say cataracts. A few suggest he could barely see at all. The details shift depending on who's telling the story and when. But the narrative core stays remarkably consistent across centuries. This man could not see clearly until the blood touched his eyes. And then, if you believe the tradition, his vision cleared. For the first time in years, perhaps in his entire life, he saw perfectly. And what he saw was the face of the man he'd just pierced. Imagine that for a moment. Put yourself in his sandals. You're a soldier doing a routine job. Unpleasant, yes, but routine. You confirm a death the same way you've confirmed dozens before. And then something impossible happens to your own body. Your eyes, your broken, clouded, useless eyes, suddenly work. The rational mind rejects it. This can't be happening. There's an explanation. The sun shifted, the dust cleared. Coincidence. But the eyes don't lie, and his eyes were telling him something his mind couldn't accept. According to the Synoptic Gospels, a centurion present at the crucifixion made a public declaration. Truly, this was the Son of God. Later tradition conflated this centurion with the soldier who made the thrust. Not all sources agree they were the same man. In fact, a centurion and an auxiliary spearman held very different ranks. But the legend fused them over time. The important thing isn't whether they were one person or two. The important thing is this: someone in Roman uniform at the foot of that cross publicly acknowledged that something extraordinary had happened. And our soldier, the one with the lance, the one with the blood on his face, now had a name. Not from the Gospels. The Gospels never name him. But tradition gave him one. Longinus, from the Greek word lonche, lance. He became his weapon. The man was erased. The instrument remained. Now Longinus faced an impossible situation. He'd witnessed something he couldn't explain. He'd experienced something he couldn't deny. And he served an empire that considered this executed man a criminal, a seditionist, a blasphemer, a threat to public order, and his followers a dangerous cult to be monitored, suppressed, or ignored into extinction. What do you do with that? He did what most of us would do. Nothing. Not immediately. He finished his shift. He returned to barracks. He said nothing to anyone. Because what would he say? I stabbed a corpse and now I can see? They'd think the sun had gotten to him. They'd think he'd lost his mind. They'd think he was trying to get out of crucifixion duty with some wild story about miracles. So he kept quiet. But silence has a shelf life, and his was about to expire. Jerusalem didn't quiet down after that Friday. 3 days later, the body disappeared from the tomb. The followers, the ones who'd scattered when the authorities came, started gathering again. They weren't hiding anymore. They were talking. Loudly. Publicly. They were claiming the executed man had risen from the dead. The authorities were furious. The soldiers who'd been assigned to guard the tomb were in serious trouble. Some accounts say they were bribed to spread a cover story about the disciples stealing the body. The whole situation was spiraling out of control, and Longinus watched all of it unfold, knowing what he'd felt, knowing what he'd seen, knowing what happened to his eyes on that garbage heap outside the city walls. The movement didn't die. That was the strange thing. Normally, when you execute a leader, the followers scatter. They mourn. They move on. They find a new leader, or they fade into history. That's how it works. Not this time. These people weren't scattering. They were multiplying. They were meeting in secret, and then not so secretly. They called themselves followers of the Way, and they were telling a story that included a Roman soldier who pierced the side of their Messiah and was healed by the blood. Longinus realized, with growing horror, that he was becoming part of their narrative. They were looking for him, not to harm him, to recruit him. Think about it from their perspective. A Roman soldier who witnessed the death and experienced a miracle. That's not just a convert. That's a weapon. That's living proof that something real happened on that cross. His testimony would be invaluable, which meant his anonymity was evaporating fast. Temple authorities and Roman officials didn't take kindly to rumors about miraculous healings at state executions. Questions started being asked. Who was on duty that day? Who made the thrust? The duty roster existed, names existed, and Longinus' name surfaced. According to later tradition, he was brought before Pilate himself, the same Pilate who had washed his hands of the whole affair, the same Pilate who had authorized the execution. Now Pilate had a new problem. One of his own soldiers was becoming a liability. The offer was simple. Deny everything. Attribute the healing to natural causes. Eyes clear up sometimes. Who knows why? Continue your military career. Forget this ever happened. War, and this part was left unspoken, but perfectly clear. Admit what happened, and face consequences that hadn't been defined yet. Because no one knew what to do with a soldier who claimed a crucified criminal had healed him. There was no protocol for this. Longinus refused to deny it. Not because he'd suddenly become a saint, not because he heard angels singing, but because he could not unsee what he saw. He could not unfeel his eyes opening. The truth, as he had experienced it, was non-negotiable. He could lie about many things. He could not lie about this. The Roman military has no tolerance for soldiers who publicly undermine imperial authority by validating the claims of executed criminals. Longinus was dismissed from service, dishonorably, according to some accounts, quietly, according to others. Either way, the result was the same. His career was over. No rank, no income, no purpose. He did the only thing that made sense to him now. He sought out the followers. He asked to be baptized. The soldier who confirmed Christ's death became a witness to his resurrection. Would you trade your rank, your salary, and your life for a single vision you cannot prove? Most of you would lie to the empire. Be honest. Leave it in the comments. Would you have had the courage of Longinus? Or would you have died in silence with the truth rotting inside you? But converting was the easy part. Living as a convert in the Roman Empire? That was something else entirely. After Pentecost, the early Christians began scattering like seeds in a storm. Persecution in Jerusalem drove believers outward, into Samaria, into Syria, on into the distant provinces of an empire that didn't yet understand what it was dealing with. Longinus, according to various traditions, went with them. Some sources place him in Cappadocia, the rugged highlands of central Anatolia, what we'd now call Turkey. Others say Caesarea. A few claim he wandered as far as Mantua in northern Italy. The specifics matter less than the pattern. A man trained to kill for Rome now traveled the Roman roads to spread a message Rome considered seditious. The irony was not lost on him. Probably. He knew those roads. He'd marched them under imperial standards. He understood the empire's geography, its choke points, its supply lines, its communication networks. He knew how information traveled and how long it took authorities to respond to problems in remote provinces. All that training, all that discipline, all that institutional knowledge, it didn't disappear when he was discharged. It got repurposed. A soldier makes an excellent missionary. He knows how to endure hardship. He knows how to organize. He knows how to assess threats. And most importantly, he knows how the enemy thinks, because he used to be the enemy. What did an ex-soldier preach? Not theology, not philosophy. Eyewitness testimony. I was there. I made the thrust. I saw the blood. I felt my eyes clear. This wasn't abstract doctrine about salvation and resurrection. This was a man standing in village squares and private homes saying, "I killed him, and he healed me anyway." That message landed differently than a second-hand account. When a fisherman from Galilee told the story, you could dismiss it as grief or delusion or a clever lie. When a Roman soldier, a man who'd served the empire, who'd participated in the execution, who had no reason to fabricate a story that destroyed his career, when that man told the story, you had to reckon with it. The danger, of course, was proportional to the power of the testimony. The empire didn't persecute Christians uniformly in this early period. Policy varied wildly by region, by governor, by the political climate of the moment. Some officials ignored the movement entirely. Others cracked down hard. There was no consistent imperial stance, just a patchwork of local responses to a phenomenon no one quite understood. But a former soldier actively spreading anti-imperial religious claims? That wasn't a random believer. That was a traitor. That was someone who'd taken an oath to Rome and then publicly repudiated everything that oath represented. That demanded a response. The years passed. Tradition is frustratingly vague on timelines. We're talking about events reconstructed centuries later from fragmentary sources, oral traditions, and hagiographic embellishment. But the broad strokes remain consistent. Longinus preached for decades. He survived multiple close calls. He built small communities of believers in places where the empire's grip was loose and attention was elsewhere. In some regions, he became a figure of local veneration while still alive. The man who pierced Christ, the soldier who saw, the testimony that wouldn't die. But fame, even underground fame, is a double-edged sword. The more people talked about him, the harder he became to ignore. Eventually, his activities reached the attention of someone who mattered, a provincial governor. Different sources give different names. Some say Octavius, others offer alternatives. But the mechanism was always the same. Someone powerful decided that this ex-soldier, this preacher, this living contradiction of imperial narrative had become a problem that needed solving. Longinus was taken into custody. He wasn't a young man anymore. Decades had passed since that afternoon on Golgotha. His hair had grayed. His body had weathered. He'd spent his entire second life knowing this moment would probably come. The question was never if, it was when. Everything you've heard so far is the story they tell openly. What happened next is the story they whisper. Because what they did to Longinus wasn't just execution. It was message sending. And the message was brutal. The charges, as best we can reconstruct them, followed a familiar pattern. Impiety toward the gods, refusal to sacrifice to the emperor's genius, that small ritual act of burning incense before an imperial image that served as a loyalty test throughout the Roman world. These were standard accusations leveled against Christians of the period, vague enough to apply to anyone, and serious enough to justify harsh punishment. But Longinus faced an additional charge, one that made his case uniquely dangerous: betrayal of military oath. The sacramentum, the oath Roman soldiers swore upon enlistment, was not a casual promise. It bound a man to the emperor, to the gods, to the standards of his unit, for the duration of his service and, in many ways, beyond. To publicly repudiate that oath by embracing a religion that rejected the emperor's divinity, that refused the traditional sacrifices, that proclaimed allegiance to a higher authority than Rome, that wasn't mere religious deviance, that was treason. The interrogation, according to hagiographic tradition, followed a script the empire had refined over generations. They didn't want a martyr. Martyrs were bad for business. Martyrs inspired imitators. Martyrs became rallying points for the very movement you were trying to suppress. What they wanted was a recantation, a public statement that Longinus had been deceived, that his healing was coincidence or fraud or misremembered hysteria, that the executed man was just a man, a criminal who died a criminal's death and stayed dead like everyone else. Give us that, and you can walk away. But Longinus refused, not with theatrical defiance according to most accounts, not with speeches or proclamations, just simple, stubborn repetition. I saw what I saw. I cannot unsay it. This is the testimony of a soldier, direct, factual, unmovable. He'd spent his military career following orders, doing unpleasant work, keeping his opinions to himself. Now he had exactly one opinion that mattered, and he would not surrender it. The governor, whoever he was, reportedly offered a final compromise. Just perform the sacrifice. One pinch of incense, a few words everyone knew were empty. The gods wouldn't care. The emperor wouldn't care. It was theater, nothing more. Do this, and your case goes away. Your military record might even be rehabilitated. You could die an old man in peace. Here's the thing about this moment, and I want you to sit with it, because it's easy to romanticize from 2,000 years away. This wasn't about belief anymore. Not really. Longinus had believed for decades. He'd organized his entire second life around that belief. The question now was simpler and harder. Integrity. If he recanted, even as empty theater, even as words he didn't mean, everything he'd said became a lie. Every convert he'd made became a fool who'd trusted a fraud. Every risk he'd taken, every community he'd built, every person who'd changed their life because of his testimony, all of it would collapse into meaninglessness. He could save his life by destroying everything his life had meant. The governor waited. Longinus refused. Again. At that point, the governor had no choice, at least by Roman legal standards. A confessed Christian who refused to sacrifice, who'd violated military oath, who showed no willingness to recant. The law was clear. Longinus was condemned to death. The method varied by account. Some sources say beheading, the relatively merciful execution reserved for Roman citizens, and occasionally for soldiers who'd served honorably before their fall from grace. Others say something worse was planned, something designed to make an example. The man who confirmed Christ's death with a lance was now sentenced to die because he wouldn't stop talking about it. He'd walked away from Golgotha thinking his day was over. Decades later, Golgotha was finally going to finish what it started. The sentence was death. But before death came something else. Something that would ensure Longinus never saw the end clearly, in any sense of the word. Here is where the title's promise is fulfilled. According to the most detailed hagiographic traditions, and I want to be precise about this because we're deep in legendary territory now, Longinus's execution included a specific preliminary punishment. They took his eyes, the eyes that tradition claimed were healed by Christ's blood, the eyes that opened on Golgotha and saw the face of the man he'd just pierced, the eyes that had become, in a sense, the entire foundation of his testimony. They were removed before his death. Think about the symmetry for a moment. Whether this detail is historical memory or narrative construction, and we cannot know for certain, its presence in the tradition tells us something about how early Christians understood his story. The miracle was reversed, not supernaturally, surgically, and the gift was taken back by human hands. Blinding as punishment wasn't unknown in the ancient world, though it was relatively rare in Roman practice. More commonly, it was associated with Eastern kingdoms, Persia, the Hellenistic successor states, where mutilation served political and symbolic purposes beyond mere execution. That it appears in Longinus's martyrology suggests either genuine historical memory of an unusually cruel punishment or careful narrative design by later hagiographers who understood the theological weight of what they were describing. Either way, the story persisted because it meant something. Imagine it. Try to see it clearly, because he couldn't. An old man. Decades removed from that afternoon outside Jerusalem, he'd spent his entire second life preaching about sight, physical sight restored, spiritual sight awakened, the clarity that came from witnessing something true. He'd told that story hundreds of times, thousands maybe, and now he saw nothing. Darkness. Pain. The last thing he would ever see was the instruments coming toward his face. Or maybe the last thing he saw was the face of his executioner. Another soldier, perhaps, doing an unpleasant job, following orders, just like Longinus had done once. After the blinding, according to tradition, he was beheaded. Some accounts add additional tortures. The hagiographic tradition tends toward accumulation, piling suffering upon suffering to emphasize holiness through endurance. The specifics matter less than the pattern. The empire didn't just want him dead, it wanted him destroyed. It wanted anyone considering following his path to understand, viscerally, what that path cost. Here is the paradox worth sitting with. Longinus opened his eyes at Golgotha and saw the face of the man he'd killed. He closed his eyes in martyrdom, blind, broken, at the end of everything. And, if his faith held, expected to see that face again. The terrible destiny. That's what the title promised, and that's what we've arrived at. Not just death. Every mortal dies. Death is not destiny. Death is appointment. The terrible destiny of the Roman who pierced Jesus was something more specific and more cruel. He lived long enough to become completely defined by a single moment. A moment he never planned, never chose, never understood until it was too late. He built an entire second life around that moment. He sacrificed everything he'd been and everything he might have become for the sake of testimony about that moment. And then, at the end, the very gift he claimed, his sight, the proof he carried in his own healed eyes, was ripped away. He died without the one thing that had made his story believable. He died unable to see the face he'd spent decades describing. That is a terrible destiny. Not because of the pain, though the pain was real, but because of the structure, because of the shape of it. A man who saw too much, forced to end in darkness. The body, according to tradition, was buried in Caesarea. Later, as the cult of relics grew, his remains were supposedly translated to various churches across Christendom. Constantinople claimed pieces of him. Rome claimed pieces of him. Mantua built a basilica around what it insisted were his bones. And the lance, that simple military tool that had made one routine thrust on a Friday afternoon, became one of the most sought-after relics of the medieval world. The Holy Lance, the Spear of Destiny. A dozen churches claimed to possess it. Crusader kings killed for possession of what they believed was the authentic weapon. Byzantine emperors displayed their version as proof of divine favor. The lance that had simply confirmed a death became a talisman that men believed could determine the fate of empires. The man disappeared into the weapon once again, just as he had when they named him. He died blind, beheaded, and largely forgotten by the empire he'd served. But that wasn't the end of his story. It was barely the beginning, for Longinus, a name probably invented centuries after the events it describes, became one of the most venerated saints of the early church. A man with no verified biography, no confirmed birthplace, no documented words beyond what hagiographers put in his mouth generations later. He became the patron saint of soldiers, of the blind, of converts who came to faith through unexpected roads. The less that was known about him, the more that was imagined. Churches rose in his honor across the Mediterranean world. Icons depicted him at the foot of the cross, lance in hand, eyes raised toward the dying figure above. Byzantine mosaics rendered him in gold and lapis, frozen forever in the moment of the thrust. The Coptic Church venerated him. The Armenian Church claimed him. The Roman Church canonized him. Everyone wanted a piece of the soldier who pierced, and the lance took on a life of its own. The Holy Lance, the spear of destiny, the weapon that touched the body of Christ and drew forth blood and water. A dozen churches across Christendom claimed to possess it, or pieces of it, or copies of it, blessed by contact with the true relic. Vienna had one. Rome had one. Echmiadzin in Armenia had one. Krakow had one. Each insisted theirs was authentic. Each built elaborate theological arguments for why the others were frauds. Crusader kings sought the lance as a talisman of invincibility. When the First Crusade captured Antioch in 1098, a peasant named Peter Bartholomew claimed visions had revealed the lance's location beneath the Cathedral of St. Peter. They dug. They found a lance point, or something that looked enough like one. The army, starving and besieged, took it as divine confirmation. They marched out to battle carrying what they believed was Longinus's weapon. They won. Coincidence? Mass delusion? Genuine miracle? The Crusaders didn't care. They had their relic, and they had their victory. That was enough. Byzantine emperors displayed their version of the lance in the imperial treasury, proof that God favored Constantinople above all other cities. When the city fell to the Fourth Crusade in 1204, the lance was among the treasures looted and scattered across Europe. Fragments multiplied. Every fragment spawned legends. Every legend spawned pilgrims. Every pilgrim spawned revenue for the churches that housed the relics. A single thrust by an anonymous soldier became a relic that shaped the politics of empires for 1,000 years. Here's the paradox worth sitting with as we reach the end. Longinus is remembered entirely because of a moment he probably wanted to forget. He confirmed a death. That's all he intended to do. He was following orders, doing his job, completing a task he'd completed dozens of times before. Nothing about that Friday afternoon was supposed to be different. Everything that followed, the healing, the conversion, the decades of preaching, the arrest, the blinding, the beheading, all of it was consequence, not plan. He didn't choose to become a saint. He didn't volunteer for martyrdom. He made one thrust with a standard-issue military lance, and the rest of his life became a response to that single action. We don't know if it happened. Not really. Not with the certainty we'd like. The healing at the cross. The sources are hagiographic, written centuries after the events, shaped by theological agendas and political pressures, and the natural human tendency to improve a story with each retelling. The decades of missionary work, plausible but unverifiable. The blinding before execution, possibly historical memory, possibly narrative construction designed to emphasize cruel irony. What we can say with confidence is this: someone thrust that lance. The Gospel of John is clear about the action, even if it names no actor. Someone stood at the foot of that cross, raised a weapon, and made the thrust that confirmed the death. That person existed. That moment happened. Everything else, the name, the healing, the conversion, the martyrdom, is what we've built around that moment. Layer upon layer of meaning, accumulated across 2 millennia, until the man himself disappeared entirely beneath the weight of his own legend. Maybe that's fitting. Longinus, whoever he was, if he was anyone specific at all, let a single moment define everything that came after. He could have walked away from Golgotha and never spoken of it again. He could have attributed his clearing vision to dust or sunlight, or the natural healing that sometimes happens for no reason anyone understands. He could have kept his mouth shut, finished his military service, collected his pension, and died in obscurity like the thousands of other soldiers who served Rome in Judea during those years. He didn't. He chose the other path, the one that led through conversion and preaching and arrest and blinding and death. The one that turned a nameless auxiliary into a saint, venerated across 3 continents. The one that made his weapon more famous than he ever was. That's either the height of integrity or the depths of delusion. Maybe both, probably both. The line between the two has always been thinner than we'd like to admit. Picture it one more time, a Roman auxiliary, standing on a garbage heap outside Jerusalem. The smell of death in the air, flies thick as smoke, 3 crosses silhouetted against a pale afternoon sky. He's holding a lance, slick with blood and water. He doesn't know he'll become a saint. He doesn't know churches will bear his name. He doesn't know crusaders will kill for his weapon. He doesn't know he'll have his eyes gouged out decades later in a provincial prison. He doesn't know anything except this. His vision just cleared for the first time in years. And the man whose side he just pierced is staring back at him with dead eyes that somehow seem to see. What do you do with a moment like that? Most people bury it. They tell themselves it didn't happen, or it didn't mean what it seemed to mean, or there's a rational explanation they'll figure out eventually. They go back to their lives. They forget. Longinus remembered. And that, more than the healing, more than the preaching, more than the martyrdom, is what made his destiny terrible. He couldn't forget. He couldn't unsee. He couldn't go back to the man he was before that thrust. The lance changed him as much as it changed the man it pierced. Longinus was one soldier who made one choice, but the empire that killed him produced thousands of others, some far worse, some far stranger, and the strangest of them might just be the man who came next. There's someone in your life who needs to hear this story. You know exactly who.